All right, everyone, welcome to week 10 of 11 for Advanced Exercise Physiology at Concordia University. And once again, I am Professor Mark Baines. We're in our final 2 weeks of the class. A few points for what we've covered recently, and then, of course, on to points for this upcoming final week as well, or this weekend, the next week, the final week. First and foremost, a few challenging concepts. Anaerobic power versus power. Generally speaking, anything that's powerful is anything that increases force, increases distance covered, moving that load or producing force, or decreasing the time, right? Work times or force times distance over time, or mass times acceleration times distance over time. You improve any of those variables, you're improving power. So be careful when you say this improves power. Saying it improves power as it relates to endurance, it improves power as it relates to the activity we're in. But when you say power, we're really referring to anaerobic power, which is really 10 seconds or less. And the text kind of gives you the idea that maybe it's 30 seconds or less. That's not wrong, but 10 seconds or less is what we're really talking about is anaerobic power, all right? I didn't knock you down for saying 30 seconds. That necessarily is not bad or wrong, but 10 seconds or less is really more toward power because that's pretty much ATP, CP, and then adenosine triphosphate, creatine phosphate, primary type 2X muscle fibers, primary energy system for power, speed, maximal strength, maximal power. So make sure you're differentiating becoming more powerful as it relates to something versus power itself when you make points about power. Okay, so a lot to be said there. Same with strength. You can say the same thing for that. Generally speaking, when we're looking at work periods that are 30, 40 seconds or less, or some aspect of the higher levels of strength and power and speed and those parameters to some extent. When you start getting that 40, 45 seconds and up, we get more and more toward glycolysis, and you're looking definitely more toward interval type work. But the textbook will refer to about 20 to 60 seconds of work with anywhere between 30 to 90 seconds rest, not more than 90 seconds, and at least 30 seconds rest, and not more than 60 seconds work. A lot of people like to do these really long intervals with short breaks. That's endurance work. That's type 1 muscle fibers. Then you're going aerobic at that point. We start having work periods that are 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and up, regardless of your rest period. Whether it's short or long, they're still going toward that. So we have to make sure we understand that if one or more parameters of work or rest are a given time frame, then that's going to be specific to endurance if the rests are really short or the work is really long. Either one, we're gearing more toward endurance. So if you're doing short rest periods with short bursts of activity, you're kind of training somewhat toward power with endurance. Endurance power, but not maximal power. Be sure you understand that. Likewise, if you have really long work periods with really long rest periods. I'm not quite sure what the goal would be there, because if we're trying to go for endurance, you should be able to recover much faster. So we have to take that into account. That's what you need to be gaining from this course thus far in terms of understanding exercise physiology, how it relates to type muscle fiber, energy systems, work output, and rest required. And of course, where applicable, really want you to be able to talk about what that means toward expectation of max heart rate percentage-wise, and of course how that relates to VO2 max, which is kind of the fourth point on here, that technically speaking, for the most part, not technically, but for the most part, it's about 10% higher heart rate percentage than it is VO2 max. So if you're about 60% VO2 max, you're looking at 70 plus, 70, 75% maximum heart rate. It isn't until you get about 90% VO2 max or higher that you start seeing it pretty consistent with, roughly speaking, the percent max heart rate. Okay. And as far as heart rate at anaerobic threshold, you can see low-level athletes or low-level people, around 50 to 60% of our max heart rate are already at their lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. Remember, lactate threshold technically occurs before anaerobic threshold. Lactate threshold can only technically be measured through measuring blood lactate. And you can measure anaerobic threshold by measuring heart rate as it relates to performance. And seeing that deflection point whereby performance is waning even though heart rate is rising. Okay, and that said, and that's for very short periods, at least 45 seconds or more, to actually understand 45 seconds work or more periods for anaerobic threshold. If you can't go less than that to get a real accurate measurement of it. I know there's tests of 30 seconds or less with 30 seconds break back and forth. It's just not going to give you real strong recognition of anaerobic threshold. It's not. And lactate versus lactic acid. A few of you are still referring to lactic acid development as being related to the lactate threshold. It's lactate. Lactic acid doesn't really figure into it. And it's okay. You're just like a lot of people who still say that. But now you've taken this exercise physiology course, you got to stop saying that. Okay, it's lactate, not lactate threshold, not lactic acid that's increasing substantially, where you reach that onset of blood lactate accumulation as you pass that lactate threshold, as you go through the anaerobic threshold as well beyond that. Okay. Then as far as this week, week 10, the second of the final 2 weeks. Female athletes, as we talk about different special populations, specifically starting with female athletes. The female triad. Osteoporosis is an issue, energy is an issue related to eating disorders oftentimes, as well as hormonal problems, menstrual issues. All those are significant factors and concerns for female athletes at pretty much any age. Osteoporosis, bone density. To increase bone density, the best way to increase bone density is compressive forces. Walking does that. Jogging does that. Running does that. Sprinting, jumping, they all do that. You've got to find the right level for your athlete to increase bone density. Loading, push exercises. When you're doing squats, deadlifts. And deadlifts are not a pull exercise. You're not pulling the bar up. You're lifting with your legs. Just like more than one of you has actually mentioned like Olympic lifting, referring to it as pulling. None of it is. Those are all pushes, and they're catches with your upper body, with your shoulder. They are not pulling exercises at all. Okay, not to any significant extent at all. But as far as osteoporosis goes, also for connective tissue strength, higher loads but lower velocities, low speeds as well for increasing connective tissue strengthening for anybody, not just females. The hormonal problems. Like anything, when someone's having hormonal deficiencies or problems, you've got to lower the intensity. How much? There's so many variabilities with that. But you're really looking at really low intensity when someone's having trouble with either estrogen levels, a little bit of testosterone levels. True for men as well. Really, anyone's having issues with that, you've got to lower the intensity. You've got to communicate well with them. And the fact is, you really have to have a good relationship with your athletes so they tell you the truth, especially if you're a male coach with female athletes. You want them to be open enough to be able to tell you, or maybe you have an assistant coach who's a female, and they can tell you, and the female coach can talk to you if you want to do that. But you got to find someone who's a betweener to be able to help you out, because those communications are really, really important for the well-being of your female athletes. And as far as the energy balance goes, eating disorders, concerns over eating and how they look is much more prevalent in females than in males, especially in North America. Unfortunately, that's a lot of it's socialized, but it is what it is, and we're facing it in a lot of cases. We've got to make sure we're very much in touch with our athletes and making sure they're eating properly, getting what they need. The biggest thing being they need more carbohydrate. It's the evil carb so many people think that it is. Particularly athletes, going to be at least that 50, 60, 65% carbohydrate intake. No registered dietitian is putting any athletes to any significant extent who are engaging in 1.5 to 2 hours plus activity every single day in less than 50% carbohydrate. The 40-30-30 diet concept idea, there's very, very short number of people they're looking at with Stanford swimmers or whatnot. It's just not an indicative study to give you real belief that that's going to be substantial for most athletes. But if in doubt, consult a registered dietitian rather than yourself for giving dietetic advice to your clients. Not a nutritionist, okay, but a registered dietitian, or someone who has actually gotten a degree in the area of nutrition and has actually passed a licensure for it, right? The Q angle, the relationship of the angle of the hip toward the knee. A lot of women have an issue with, wider hips, a wider pelvic region than males. And consequently, the knee is at an angle sharply inward, basically looking like they have, like a knee valgus kind of concept going on. But it's a structure. That said, the best way to strengthen for that, just like osteoporosis, higher loads, meaning what's high for them. Doesn't mean you have to be 85, 90% of 1 rep max. Just higher than they're used to, and slowly build up with control. Don't do a lot of explosive activities when someone has a significant Q angle and lacks the strength. When you're seeing your athletes have that significant knee angle going in like that, they have to do a lot more strength training in addition to whatever skill development and conditioning you're doing with your athletes. Okay. Young athletes, the biggest concern for them, two big concerns. The epiphyseal plate slippage or growth plate damage, which is basically at the end of long bones like the humerus and the femur. The concern is if you overload them, or if you injure, or if you break that plate more specifically. It's usually, a lot of people think that it has to do with overloading your athletes. To give them enough weight that actually the weight itself would crush the plate would be astronomical. What it usually is an impact-related issue where a kid falls and runs into something. They break it through a tremendous, tremendous force. The idea that kids can't lift weights is ridiculous. Just ridiculous. It's real simple. They lift weights all day long. They run in the jump. right? A lot of older people can't do that. They have to lift weights. It's all relative to their level. If they can control the motion, the weight is fine for them. It's just that simple. Can they not control it? It's too heavy. True of anyone, not just kids. As far as work durations and volume, one of the big problems is for a lot of people who are coaching young athletes that are really good athletes that are in that 17 years of age and younger, especially the 14 years of age and younger, they tend to treat them like Olympic athletes sometimes and running a huge number of intervals. And durations of work need to be we need to be very cautious with that. They're not going to be able to go for 10, 20 plus minutes at the same pace. And a younger, more elite athlete would be, typically speaking. There's always exceptions. So be careful with volume of work and duration of work. More specifically, if you're going to do intervals of sprints or endurance step work, I really like the number 4. With my experience with kids at basketball, kids in track and field, 4 was about the right number. 4 400s or 4 200s or 4 100s. And if they perform really, really well, obviously you start with 1 or 2, right? If they can perform 4 really, really well, we talk about more. But none of this 10 and 12 and 15 and 20 repetitions or sets. That's ridiculous. Let's be nice to our kids, okay? Diabetic athletes. The most predominant need for a diabetic who's having a blood sugar related issue, just like a hypoglycemic, is carbohydrate. Particularly like tube frosting is a great thing to carry around with you for your athletes out there in the field or on the court. Also carb drink, really easy, but of course that can get, if it's not cold, or it can get hot and ruin it. Something can be, that's why frosting is such a great one. But that said, diabetic athletes need carbohydrate if they're having a sort of blood sugar related issue. They know, if they're insulin dependent, they know what to do. They honestly know this stuff really well, probably better than you ever will. But the fact is, sugar and carb are not the same thing. Sugar is a monosaccharide, the basic sugar. Polysaccharides are starches. They are not sugars, should not be referred to as sugars, and not in the same category of concern because they contain fiber and other nutrients that basic sugars do not. We've got to be careful as an athlete, as a coach, ever referring to carb and sugar as the same thing. Sugar is a carb. Carb is not necessarily a sugar, right? Cardiovascular exercise, the most predominant need for people who are diabetic, 30 to 40 minutes a day. Okay, that's the best way to regulate blood sugar and have very, very little issues with diabetic problems. That means moderate intensity to lighter intensity, not high intensity. If they're ready for more, great. Just make sure they are. Older athletes, sarcopenia, a loss of muscle, hyperatrophy of muscle, occurs more and more after age 50. As much as every 10 years, about 10% can be going down or more every 10 years after 50. As much as 50% of that muscle loss is due to age, but that means 50% or more of it is due to disuse or improper use. So we can gain back half or possibly more of it if we strengthen on a regular basis. That's a huge, huge component and important factor for older athletes. That's also true of VO2 max. You lose about half of it if you don't use it. So use it, right? Carbs daily, it's about 45 to 65% of your diet should be coming from carbohydrate. American College of Sports Medicine, Institute of Medicine, American Dietetics Association all agree there. During exercise, about every 15 to 20 minutes of exercise, an hour or more, should be 6 to 8 ounces of like a carbohydrate drink like Gatorade. Gatorade nailed it. Perfect research. A lot of people don't like Gatorade. Sorry, I don't like it. Still nailed their research. Still a great drink for 15 to 20 minutes, every 6 to 8 ounces for athletes who are engaged in an hour plus of hard activity. Okay, after exercise, 30 to 90 minutes after, looking at about 30 to 100 grams of carbohydrate intake afterward. Okay, not including the post-workout meal, which should be mostly carb, moderate protein, low fat. Protein, about 20-25 grams per sitting. No more than that. Body can't utilize it. It can absorb it, but can't utilize it. So that's the number. 0.8 to 1.8 grams per kilogram total protein per day for tissue building, regeneration. Please don't refer to protein as that's what's give your energy back post-workout. That's not true. It's tissue regeneration, replenishment, but you need the energy too, where protein can't do its job. Fat. Primary job is hormone function and the sex hormone development, testosterone and estrogen, right? You need to have a lot more of the omegas, the omega-3s in particular, fish oil, nuts, seeds, as much as you can. Getting good quality numbers of those things is crucial for proper fats in the diet. Water intake, urinate every 2 hours. That's how you know if you get enough water. Color, clear or bright yellow. And during and after exercise, we're talking about making sure you get enough the next 3 hours to replace any weight you lost by 1.5 to 2. Okay. Posts are been solid as a whole. Keep it going. Extra credit. I mentioned it in the last weekly post for what to do. Email me if you have questions. Call, email if you have questions. My whole job is to help you out here. We're in our last 2 weeks, and I know this class has been hard on a lot of classes you've taken in this coursework. That's my job, to make it useful to you, not to make it harder or easier. Honestly, I wish it was the easiest. But the fact is, I want you to get the information because I want you to be great coaches. I want you to get better as you go. We all need to get better. I do too. Let's keep it up. See you soon.